Good evening, parents and carers and Forest community members. I hope you are all well, and I know some of you this evening will be potentially watching our Les Miserables performance, and you'll be watching this at a later date. So I can't wait to see it tomorrow. But welcome to those live audience members that we have with us this evening. I hope you are well. Hopefully we won't experience any technical difficulties. We always say that, but please do bear with us if we do encounter any difficulties, and we'll ensure that that is sorted out for you as soon as possible. Also, I'd like to promote our next webinar, which is happening on Tuesday, the 5th of December next week, on managing uncomfortable emotions, led by the organisation Role Models. And I cannot believe that I'm actually sharing with you that that's going to be our last one as part of our Michaelmas series of Forest Focus webinars. But in the next 2 weeks, I'll be sharing the Lent webinar Forest Focus schedule for you all. And I hope you're going to feel very reassured by the variety of topics we have. But let's focus on our speakers this evening. We have two speakers this evening. First of all, I'm going to introduce Asha Fowells, and she has been a drugs educator at the DSM Foundation since 2018, and recently took on an additional position as media manager, so very, very busy for the drugs education charity. These roles reflect her background as a pharmacist, and she qualified in 1998, a journalist and a writer. So we're in the presence of fantastic speakers this evening. As the DSM's Foundation's most experienced drugs educator, Asha is involved in the whole breadth of delivery, from students to parents and carers, school staff and other professionals working with young people. And I can speak firsthand, working with our speakers this evening and with myself and Miss Arthur on our RSHE conference that we delivered with other schools last academic year. They truly are a spectacular organisation and individuals. She also does a lot of work behind the scenes at the Foundation, including dealing with press inquiries, writing resources, mentoring other members of the team. And Asha is passionate about the aims of the DSM Foundation, as we are at Forest as well, which is to help young people make safer choices about drugs, and everybody should be able to get home safely. I'm going to also introduce Fiona Spargo-Mabbs, OBE, congratulations Fiona, director and founder of the Daniel Spargo-Mabbs Foundation. She's an award-winning author of books for parents and carers. In 2023, she was awarded an OBE for services to young people. Truly remarkable. With over 2 decades experience working in education as a teacher, manager and national leader, and a specialism working with vulnerable families, Fiona co-founded the DSM Foundation in 2014 in response to the death of her 16-year-old son, Daniel, having taken ecstasy. As well as working directly with young people, parents, carers, professionals herself, Fiona is also regularly asked to speak on various national platforms and the media, and a TEDx talk, Why Drugs Education is Vital, can be seen online. And I would really, really highlight parents and carers that you watch that following this webinar. She's closely involved in policy work with government, police, academics and other agencies, and works in close partnership to influence change nationally. And I can speak from firsthand, she's truly an inspirational person to work with. And please, for more information, I know we put it in our communication about the DSM Foundation, please see the website that I'll also put in the comments chat following me introducing the speakers. There was a survey that went out to capture some of your questions. Thank you to those parents and carers and community members that did share some of those questions that our speaker is going to answer this evening as best as possible. And I remind you to use the comments box on our YouTube channel to ask any additional questions. And like I said, we will do our best to get to them. Without further ado, parents and carers, I'm going to introduce Fiona Spargo-Mabbs.
Thank you so much, Natasha, and thank you so much to all of you for coming along. Before I get going, we have the capacity to take confidential questions. We'd love you to ask questions, and Asha and I have got some extra time at the end of the webinar this evening to take any questions. We're conscious all the comments here are public, but if anyone's got any private questions that are a bit more sensitive or they'd like responded to confidentially, you can email media@dsmfoundation.org.uk, and Asha will pick those up in between things. So Asha and I are going to share the evening this evening. Natasha's done a great job of telling you about who we are and why we do what we do, and we do what we do because of Dan. And I'll tell you very, very, very short version of Dan's story, but it is all about, we are all about supporting young people to make safe choices about drugs and supporting the important adults in their lives, of which you are the most important. So what we're going to be doing this evening is a little bit of a story, but really focusing on what it's useful for you to know as parents and for your children to know about the risks of drugs and alcohol. We're going to also think about decision making, because it's really important to have lots as good, reliable, current, relevant information as possible. But you also need to have, as a teenager, the strategies to manage those decision-making situations, however much you know, which are never harder. We're going to look quite explicitly at conversations, as well as the whole evening, really, hopefully being content, strategies, approaches that will be useful to bring to those conversations, and also some really practical strategies that you can put in place at home to help your children stay safe. What to do if you have got concerns, that different sort of conversation that you might need to have, and where you can go for more information and support. And of course, we've got loads and loads of stuff on our website, and at the end we'll signpost you to an Educated webpage that we've set up specifically for the end of parents webinars, to signpost people to everything that we've covered and a whole load more as well. So that's what we're going to do this evening. And there's a little bit of Dan. There was a 2-minute story about Dan. So Dan was our younger son, and he died a couple of days after taking MDMA, which was just an enormous shock to everybody. It just came completely from nowhere, it seemed to us. Dan wasn't somebody that would have been on anybody's radar. In the stereotypes, I guess, that we can have in our heads, it's just there were no signs. There was nothing. Dan was bright, big-hearted, funny, endlessly chatty. He was the prom king of his school, which is basically a popularity test. At the end of year 11, he was overwhelmingly voted prom king. Everyone was friends with Dan. He'd got a lovely girlfriend, Jenna, he'd been going out with for more than 2 years when he died. He'd gone into sixth form at school, and was doing really, really well, actually, after that initial adjustment from GCSEs to A-levels. It got to January, and he came home from school on a Friday and said, "Oh yeah, Mum, there's a party tonight. Is it all right if I go?" So I asked all those questions that you ask, and there was a bit of toing and froing about this party. Where would it be, and who'd be there, and when would he be back, and how is he going to get back? And there were things that were a bit unusual. They didn't sit quite right, but didn't sit quite wrong either. You know, he's 16 going on 17 and having new experiences, and you're making those judgment calls all the time, aren't you, as they get older. And this one, unfortunately, we didn't get right between us. It wasn't a party, it was an illegal rave miles away from us. We're just in South London, in Croydon. It was way out the other side of London to us, and mostly friends of a new friend of Dan's, a boy who joined the school for sixth form. Friends of his from the school he'd been at before, who'd got this plan to go to this rave, and a plan that some of them were going to take MDMA. And Dan, unfortunately, was one of the 5 that was in with the MDMA. And unfortunately for Dan, the little bag of white powder that he got, which looked identical to everybody else's, turned out to have been 12 times stronger than had caused fatality in the past. So he just massively overheated, was rushed off to intensive care, spent a couple of days on life support, and died from multiple organ failure. And we started the charity because that just doesn't need to happen. Nobody needs to come to any sort of harm from drugs. What happened to Dan, obviously, worst case scenario, but you are here because you know that drugs and alcohol can and do cause so many shades of harm and damage. And young people are coming across drugs and making decisions about drugs and alcohol at a rate that was certainly not the case when I was a teenager. And it's never been more important than it is now to make sure that they are as well armed as they can be with the information and understanding, but also those really important decision-making skills and strategies for those complicated teenage social contexts. So I'm going to hand over to Asha. I'm going to disappear backstage again, and Asha is going to tell you a little bit more about the kind of the information underpinning knowledge you'll need.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much as well to all of those parents and caregivers who are with us this evening, and thank you to Forest for inviting us in. You do matter as parents and caregivers and as school staff as well, actually. You can see here from this survey data, which is done every couple of years by the NHS. It's a really big piece of work that they do. And on the last occasion, they asked nearly 10,000 11 to 15-year-olds a whole host of questions. It's all done anonymously, so there's no vested interest in kind of exaggerating or underplaying anything. And it gives us some really useful kind of benchmarking data around what the context is for young people and drugs and alcohol and decision making and all of that stuff that we're talking about this evening. When it comes to alcohol, over 3/4 of those who responded to that question said that they would turn to their parents. And with drugs, it was over 2/3. And you can see that teachers come up second on both of those. And some of those things that you think might be more common sources of information for them, such as social media or their friends, they actually come up a lot lower. And so kind of having that understanding of what it is that they're doing, that can really inform what you're talking about, because you are having much more of an influence on them than perhaps you give yourselves credit for. And I say that as the parent of teenagers myself, that it's really easy to think that what you say just doesn't land with them, but it really, really does. So useful to kind of just establish what drugs are. They are substances that will in some way interfere with chemical reactions, neurotransmitter levels in the brain. And I'm talking about chemicals such as adrenaline, dopamine, serotonin, all things that I'm sure you've heard of. But by changing those natural chemical processes, it changes how we would normally feel. And those changes can be physical in nature. For example, vital signs such as heart rate and breathing rate can change. It will also alter brain signaling, which will mean that people feel more alert or more sleepy than would otherwise be the case. But there's also going to be impacts in terms of our thought processes, which in turn is going to have an impact on our behaviour. Now, in terms of what's out there, we don't just rely on external sources of information because we are an evidence-based charity. That's really important when we're talking to young people, when we're talking to anybody really, because it can't just be about our personal opinions. It has to be about facts and stats and scientific research and clinical data, all of that stuff that will really help young people make those informed choices, because it's them that are going to be in those situations. As parents, as teachers, we just can't be with them all the time, and they have to be able to do this for themselves. So it's really important that they are making those decisions based on kind of the most up-to-date, relevant, age-appropriate information for them. So something that we do is we gather information from them before we go and talk to them, and this is for the kind of older year group, so usually year 11 and upwards. So far this academic year, I prepared this slide deck on Monday, and since then I had a look today. We've had over 1,800 responses to this particular question, and it's just since the beginning of September. But it kind of gives us an idea of what is around for them. And they talk about vaping and they talk about alcohol. And that's pretty much the same wherever we go, because we do go into lots and lots of different places, nearly 700 settings now. And we go geographically quite far. We go into a different range of schools: private, state, single sex, boarding, faith schools, super selective, the whole range. And it's pretty much the same picture across the board. So vaping and alcohol normally come out the top, and then smokable things, so weed, cannabis, and then cigarettes, tobacco products obviously, and then it's quite a significant drop down to things like edible forms of cannabis, nitrous oxide, and then we hear in smaller numbers again about things like ketamine, cocaine, magic mushrooms, and so on. The other category is always really interesting. We get a significant number of people who say I don't know, which does kind of bolster that figure, but we also hear about street names or kind of quite generic names, and that's a really kind of good thing to kind of emphasize, because drugs are known by so many different names, and some of them are quite obvious because it will relate to a plant name such as cannabis or a chemical name such as MDMA, but some of those names are around perceived effects like ecstasy or magic mushrooms, and some of them are quite generic like pills, which could refer to all kinds of different things. And then of course there are street names, and those names are used differently by different people, and so it's always really important that someone has a really clear understanding about what they're getting themselves into, because they will have an expectation about what's going to happen to them. And if what happens is different, that can really mess with them physically, mentally, and emotionally. And a really basic reason for that happening is that it is not the substance that they think it is. And a common reason for that is because they've just got the name wrong. Now, in terms of what happened to Dan, he was one of 5 boys who took ecstasy that evening. And it was one boy who'd got in touch with a dealer. They'd got 5 bags of white powder. They looked identical. They gave them out at random. And it just so happened that Dan was the one who got this bag that was incredibly strong. It was 12 times stronger than had caused fatality in the past, but you couldn't tell by looking at it that there was going to be anything different about it at all. And this is because we're talking about illegal drugs, which are made in a completely different way to products such as medicines, which of course are also drugs. They do change things about us physically, mentally, sometimes emotionally, but they're made in nice clean manufacturing units, and there's lots of regulations and guidance in place to kind of make sure that they're safe, effective, and you know, the quality is what it should be. Whereas with illegal drugs you have none of that, and these pictures really illustrate that point. They're taken from a short film that shows ecstasy pills being made, and it is dirty and messy and unhygienic and just incredibly careless. The problem for people who are buying and using is that what these guys are selling, it looks like the real deal and they all look the same, but in reality they're going to be very, very variable in terms of their component parts. And that means that with any illegal substance, you just don't know what you're getting. They are unknown quantities. Sometimes these things can look like they've been diverted from pharmacies or from doctors' surgeries, but that will not have been the case. It's an incredibly tightly regulated market, lots of checks and balances in place, and it would be very, very difficult to subvert, but also incredibly expensive. And it's much, much cheaper and easier to just make something look like something. So when people do think that they are taking pharmaceuticals, the likelihood is that they aren't. They've just been made to look like it. The only way to know what you're getting is to get stuff tested, and this isn't something that is very widely available. The picture that you can see on this is taken from a festival where the Loop were there doing some drug testing on site, and they do a proper chemical analysis. And sometimes that can be kind of face to face, where people can hand in a sample of their drugs. They don't get into trouble for doing that, and a proper chemical analysis will be done. And then also a little intervention. So someone's saying to them, well, what we've tested contains this, and we know that you gave in a sample of your batch, and batches differ. But if you've taken that, this is what's likely to happen to you. Whereas there's also kind of back of house testing where things will have been picked up from amnesty bins, maybe from people who have become unwell. And again, that information will be made available, particularly if there are substances that are circulating that are likely to cause serious harm. And this is a couple of examples of the alerts that this organisation will put out. It could be that there are things that are really strong, so they're likely to kind of cause adverse effects, or maybe there are things that are being sold as one thing and they don't contain that. So that whole dilemma between expectations and reality is going to be very present for that. There can be different versions of the same product floating around with different ingredients in. So again, you're going to get that difference between expectations and reality. So drug testing, it can be quite contentious, but in places where we know that there is going to be drug use, like festivals, it's actually a really important harm reduction measure because it allows people to make slightly more informed choices. And actually, where this is available, they will often choose to take less, to not take things at all, particularly if they're not what they think they are, and it really shapes their behaviour. Now, I'm going to look at individual substances now, and I'm going to focus on the 3 that young people in our survey tell us cause the most problems for their peers, and they are vaping. Over 3/4 say that they're worried about their friends vaping, and alcohol and cannabis. And for each of those, it's over 50% that they say are worried about their friends using these. So I'm going to really focus on how maybe you might want to find a way into conversations about these kind of individual substances. And I'm starting with vaping, which has become the most popular and the most effective way in the UK to help people stop smoking. And that in a way has legitimised it because it is kind of of a harm reduction approach on itself. The problem is that the reason it works so well to help people stop smoking is because it contains nicotine, and nicotine is incredibly addictive. It is much more addictive to people when they're younger because their brains go through a big process of change, which Fiona will explain to you in a bit more detail. But basically, if you put a drug which fundamentally changes the brain into a brain that is already going through changes, such as happens during adolescence, the changes that it causes are likely to be much more profound and long lasting than would otherwise be the case. And so that's why there is that age restriction around nicotine containing products. They shouldn't be used or sold to under 18s. While they are used to help people stop smoking, there is increasing evidence that actually they can go the other way. And so people who vape are more likely to take up smoking. The amount of nicotine in vapes can be considerable. So the regulated products, things like the Elf bars, the Lost Marys that we know are particularly popular among young people, these disposable products, they can contain the equivalent of nearly 50 cigarettes. And so it's really easy to take on a lot of nicotine in a short space of time, which obviously increases that potential for addiction. There are also a lot of unregulated products out there, often being sold by the places that will sell to underage people. They are essentially part of an illegal supply chain, and they are completely unregulated. They won't have been through any checks and balances in terms of how much nicotine they contain or all of those other chemicals as well. And vapes do contain around 2,000 chemicals. That is what people are breathing in when they are vaping. And there is growing evidence that these are health harming products. And the nature of those harms is actually really similar to those caused by smoking. So problems with the lungs and so on. Worth thinking about the environmental impact. This can be a really good way into a conversation if you see them discarded on the pavement and so on. 5 million vapes actually are thrown away every week in the UK. That is a huge amount, obviously. Single-use plastic, single-use metal, precious metals like lithium in those batteries and so on. There are recycling facilities, but a lot of people are just not using them. And the marketing around vapes can be quite exploitative. It isn't uncommon for these things to pop up on people's socials. That's a very difficult market to regulate in terms of the messaging. And by them seeing them on their feeds, what it does is it normalizes for them. It makes it seem like it's a lifestyle choice, that loads of people are doing it, when that probably is not the case. In fact, statistics really show that it is a very small minority of young people who are vaping, and particularly vaping regularly. But this gives some really mixed messaging. And if they do feel that it is normal, they are much more likely to engage in that behaviour. And it's no accident that it's happening. You know, these vaping companies, they are kind of promoting it that way. In terms of alcohol, something that can be quite useful to talk about is the concept of units of alcohol, because the first time people start drinking, it's probably not in a bar or pub where things are being measured. It's probably an informal setting where it's much more difficult to gauge how much you're kind of taking in. So having an understanding of what a unit looks like in different things can be really, really helpful. So show them, basically, show them just using equivalents of water even. So they get a sense of how something like wine is much stronger than beer or cider, and things like vodka and whiskey are much, much stronger again. So the equivalent volume of liquid for beer, it will be 1 unit if it's half a pint, but for wine it would be 3.5, and for things like vodka and whiskey it would actually be 10. And just that sense of how many units you're taking on board. Parents are role models, really important to remember that. The recommended maximum is 14 units per week. That is around health outcomes as opposed to behaviour. And that shouldn't all be done in one go. That should be spread out throughout the week with some alcohol-free days in between. And if you are role modelling kind of really positive behaviour with alcohol, being responsible with it, you will normalise that for your children. And so they are much more likely to emulate that. But equally, if they see you being kind of drunk or using even alcohol as a coping strategy, you normalise that. So just kind of be careful about that. Children under the age of 15 should not drink alcohol at all. There's really clear evidence that it causes a lot of damage in terms of the changes that their brains and their bodies go through, and just kind of that reinforcing that message that it is okay to not drink at all. A significant number of young adults, 16 to 24-year-olds, actually in a recent survey said that they had decided that they were going to be teetotal, and normalizing that again and making them feel that it's not weird, it's not unusual, because they may well be getting messages that everybody's drinking. It can be a really powerful thing to kind of reinforce what is the actual social norm rather than what their perception of it is. Also, do talk to them about their limits as well as units. Have an understanding that limits will be different occasion to occasion, but also between individuals. And that kind of quite basic messaging around eating carbs beforehand, drinking water, and just pacing yourself. And that sense as they get older that the liver can only process 1 unit per hour, and that becomes really important with driving. So being able to track how many units someone has had can be a really powerful tool in terms of working out when someone is actually okay to drive. Though it isn't very much at all that puts you over the drink drive limit. And of course, people's behaviour is impaired in different ways. Someone who's hungover, for example, they might not still have alcohol in their system, but their reaction and coordination is not going to be what it should be. Now, cannabis has lots of effects on people's behaviour, and they really come about because of the balance between the two, what we call psychoactive chemicals within cannabis, THC and CBD. Now, really the big one here is THC. It causes this kind of relaxed, chilled out vibe that people are normally after, but can also cause a lot of negative effects, from acute things like panic attacks, paranoia, aggression, vomiting, to much longer term issues around things like mood and motivation and learning and memory. And the problem that we have in the UK is that cannabis is incredibly strong, and it's really changed over the last 10 to 15 years. So nowadays cannabis is around 90 to 95% THC, whereas probably 15, 20 years ago, you were looking at kind of under 50%. And that means that there are many more problems with cannabis use than has ever been the case. And one of those is underachievement, because of it kind of stripping people of their motivation and their ability to learn and make memories. Also a higher risk of addiction because it's so strong. It's the biggest reason why young people seek help for their drug use. And it does increase the risk of mental health problems, things like anxiety, depression, but also the psychosis type conditions such as schizophrenia. They are more common, or there is an increased risk in people who do use cannabis. And it's worth bearing in mind that people might have other risk factors for mental health problems. So adding cannabis into the mix, it can accelerate things. Very quickly, I should have said about edibles. The way that they're made is a bit different to how weed that people smoke is made, and often very kind of unpredictable in the amount of THC they contain, but also very high. We've come across quite a few instances where they're laced with other products, and one of the most common ones is actually spice, which is synthetic cannabis. Looks very similar in terms of its molecular structure, but in terms of the effects, it's actually really, really different. So I realise that I've moved through stuff really quite quickly, and it's because we are a little bit kind of constrained around time. If you are interested in finding out more about any of the substances that I've talked about, or more general risks, Fiona and I have done a whole series of short videos which are available through our Facebook page, but also on our website. And we'll be providing links for all of these towards the end of the session, QR codes and URLs that you can go to, but you might want to make a note of these now as well. We've also got written information because some people like to watch things, but some people prefer to read things. And again, it's a good way of getting lots of information in quite a short space of time. And like everything that we do, it's evidence-based. And we talk about what those sources are as we go through, so you kind of have that assurance as well. Right, I'm going to hand over to Fiona now. She's going to take you through the next section of this.
Thanks, Asha. Right, we're going to think about decision making. There is always a reason behind everything that we all do. Sometimes it takes a bit of digging around to find it, and never more so really than when you're a teenager. But there will always be something that's behind that. They may have no idea what it is. It may be very complicated, but it's worth keeping that in mind when the things that our teenagers might be doing can sometimes be a bit frustrating or baffling or bewildering. But there is always a reason there. One thing it's good to be aware of as a parent is that drugs are hard to avoid and increasingly difficult to avoid as they go through their teens. We can see from the data here that most young people aren't saying yes, but some of them are, and more than we would like. And that number had been on an upward trend from 2014. There's been a little bit of a dip there. But the survey that was run, that Asha referred to at the beginning, by the government, that this was run in autumn 2021 when COVID was still having a bit of an impact. So it's difficult to see that that's a trend. But you can see from that, if you look on the right-hand side there, for 11-year-olds, 12% have been offered drugs. And this isn't alcohol or vapes. This is controlled substances. For 15-year-olds, that was around about half. So if you've got a 15-year-old, 50% chance that they've already had to make a decision about drugs. And 1 in 3 have said yes, on possibly just on one occasion. Who they got them from, mostly it was from a friend. It's that friendship group. One person will get them in, they'll share them out. Somebody at some point's got to get it from a dealer, and about 1 in 4. However, mostly it's in that social context, and where they got them are mostly in those social spaces that teenagers inhabit. So the park, the street, someone else's house, their own home. It could be at those places and venues that you might associate more with drug use, but that's much lower down the list than those kind of casual, informal spaces. And it's good to be aware as well that social media plays an increasing role. Especially, actually, it seems to be especially Snapchat in terms of drug offers, but social media has made access to drugs, exposure to drugs completely, it's been a complete game changer, really, for young people. We have been doing a lot of work around that over the last few years, really since 2020, 2019, and we've run 2 surveys. We're just running one again, so hopefully Forest School will be able to help us out with that. And we're doing that this time with UCL. But the most recent survey we ran, which is a couple of years ago now, found that 1 in 3 15-year-olds had seen drugs for sale on social media, and 1 in 3 who'd bought them had bought them through social media. So that's really worth bringing to your conversations in terms of the risks that social media can expose them to and how they can manage them. When we think about decision making and risks and consequences, being aware of the legal risks and consequences is also really important to bring to those conversations. But also for us as parents, there can be consequences without us necessarily realizing that there might be. If you were to find drugs on your child, in a pocket or a school bag or a bedroom, or actually on them, you really must hang on to them. Otherwise, you're in possession of a controlled substance, and that puts you in a difficult position. What you do with them is up to you, but just don't hang up onto them. It's also an offence to allow drug use in your home, to turn a blind eye, maybe to the kids at the end of the garden smoking weed at a party, or it's not okay in terms of the law. There are other people's kids. There are also other reasons why it might not be okay, even though there are understandable reasons why parents might let that happen. You know, you can keep an eye on them. You know where they are. They're only going to be doing it somewhere else anyway, and where you don't know where they are and you can't keep an eye on them. But it is a criminal offence. In terms of supply, this is the biggest hole that teenagers can fall in because of that social supply that I was telling you about, that friendship group supply where someone will get them in and share them out. But in the eyes of the law, as soon as drugs pass from one pair of hands to another, that is the supply of drugs, and there can be really serious consequences for that. There can be young people getting criminal convictions which can limit their options forever. Other criminal offences, a lot of those are to do with the way that substances can affect people's judgment, coordination, behaviour. You can add consent to that in terms of the drinking, drug driving, breach of the peace and so on. And of course, as you will know, those consequences can just stick with them forever. You know, there are countries they'll never get a visa for. You have to put any criminal convictions on a UCAS form. Obviously, there are jobs that would be impossible to get with criminal conviction. So another thing to talk about. In terms of motivation, this again is from the NHS Digital Survey. And one of the questions they asked was, for those that had taken drugs, why did they take drugs on the first occasion? And you can see from there, the biggest reason is curiosity. And that probably doesn't surprise you. Children and teenagers are hardwired to be curious, which is brilliant because it's how they learn. And it's sad that we lose that really when we get older. But because they are naturally curious, that's why these conversations are just so important, because they need to have something to bring to that curiosity. But for the effect is also there, and for the older ages particularly, that's the next biggest reason why they took something on the first occasion. They wanted to feel high or to get high or feel good, or maybe have that sense of relaxing. Just that joining in. Peer pressure is, as we know, an enormous factor, and we'll go on to talk about that, but it's not as high up as the others. One of the ones that is a real concern is that bottom one. I wanted to forget my problems, and that has shifted. And again, not necessarily a trend. COVID was around, but we know that that lasting impact on young people's mental health of COVID, but also the upward trend that had been already causing so much concern about young people's mental health. For 11-year-olds and 13-year-olds, it was the second biggest reason they gave for taking drugs on the first occasion. So somewhere they're getting a message that drugs are going to help. And this again is controlled substances. It's not even alcohol or vapes, which would also be there. But somewhere they're getting a message this is going to help them cope with things that are difficult and help them forget their problems. And that's reflected, as you can see there in the survey that the mix runs, that's reflected for older teenagers as well. That's a survey of 16 to 24-year-olds that the mix runs every year. And that had doubled in just the last year, or in a 12-month period. One of the reasons why it is really difficult to manage those decisions safely when they're with their friends in particular, but anyway at this stage of life, is that their brain is at a really, really critical stage of development, and it's developing at the different regions of the brain are developing at different rates, and it kind of develops from the back to the front. So the back of our brain is where the kind of, I guess, the most kind of instinctive, but all the social emotional stuff sits there, particularly in our limbic system. Our prefrontal cortex, our thinking, kind of rational, sensible thinking things through brain, that's that bit behind our forehead. That's the very last bit to develop. But our limbic system is really, really well developed and really early on in adolescence. And in adolescence, it's hypersensitive to social emotional variables. And remember, adolescence is a really long time. So it starts around about puberty when they're kind of 10, 11, 12, doesn't finish. That brain, that rewiring process that they're going through, that's changing that brain from the brain of a child to the brain of an adult, doesn't finish until they're in their mid-20s. The last part of us to become fully adult, our brain. And in adolescence, it's really sensitive to those social emotional variables, and you'll see that. There is also in adolescence an increased release of dopamine, that pleasure and reward neurotransmitter, but the brain is also much more responsive to it than at any other stage of life. Where risk comes in is that in the structure of our brains, risk and reward are really closely connected. So in adolescence, with that very responsive limbic system, teenagers can experience a sense of reward in response to a risk, more so than they will at any other stage of life. And the really useful bit of their brain that would help them out in those decisions just isn't easy to access until they're, as I say, kind of early to mid-20s, when it's all fully wired up and fully operational, all being well. And that's the bit that's useful for planning, organising, decision-making, problem-solving, and thinking things through, all that what would happen if stuff. It's also our natural emotional handbrake. So it's the bit that helps us regulate our emotions and manage our impulses, moderate our social behaviour. So that's why for teenagers, all of those things can just be that much harder. And that mismatch means it's takes longer for them to think through the consequences, and sometimes they've acted before they've been able to do that, and it's much harder for them to manage their impulses and responses in the moment. The more you understand this, the more we understand this as parents and carers, but also the more young people understand this themselves, the more they can bring to those decision-making situations in terms of understanding what's going on for them, but also for the adolescents around them, the better armed they are to face those decisions safely. And it's that social context when drugs and alcohol are mostly going to be around. And the role of their peers, as you know, is so incredibly powerful. That some of that's just developing independence. They're becoming independent adults. They're on that journey, and there's that shifting relationship with their primary caregivers, which can be a bit awkward and sticky and painful, can just be a little bit bumpy, but it has to happen. And it means that their friends become increasingly important to them. They need to know that they're okay and safe outside that safe family home. They're spending more time together. We're all influenced by the behaviour of people around us, the people that we spend time with, whatever age we are, but never more so than in adolescence. And there is this heightened sensitivity in adolescence, because of this well-developed limbic system, to social reward, but also social exclusion. And that means that when they're with their friends, they're going to take more risks than they are, almost certainly, than they are when they're on their own. However naturally cautious they are, they're more likely to take risks when they're with their friends than when they're on their own, or when emotions are running high, or they're feeling under pressure, because that limbic system is going to be really, really in charge. And risk-taking peaks between 13 and 16. Then it starts to get better, but it takes a little while, really, again, before that's all fully connected up in a useful kind of way. So if you've got children between 13 and 16, particularly 14 and 15, they really, really do need extra special help to manage those social risks, particularly, to have strategies to bring to that. They almost certainly won't think that they do, but they really, really do. There are things that we can put in place as parents and as families that will help to protect them. We have to prepare them for going out and facing risks on their own without us around, but there are things that we can put in place for them that have been shown in studies to be protective when it comes to substance use in adolescence. So for the individual child, anything you can do to develop any of those things that have a value for their physical development, helping them regulate their emotions, building their self-esteem, helping them develop coping and problem-solving strategies and skills, so that when they're in that moment of decision-making, they've got resources to bring to that, and engagement with things that are bigger than themselves, where they've got a role and where they matter and where they're doing things alongside other people. So school, really protective, positive engagement with school, but also sports and arts, culture, drama, music, employment, volunteering, religion, culture, and that family, that supportive family structure can be so incredibly protective. And as I was saying, through adolescence, that shape of that shifts all the time, but it remains the most important thing, which is where Asha started. You are the most important influences in their lives, and anything you can do to take any opportunity to build and strengthen that connectedness, any opportunity to talk about the tiniest little things, will really, really help when the big important things come along on either side. Where there's structure and boundaries and values, where there are limits and where there's monitoring, all of those things have been shown to be protective. But it gets really tricky in the teenage years, because they do have to flex and change, and you've got to do that increasing amount of letting go, which takes those judgment calls, which is tricky. But as long as there is a structure there, and there are things that are okay and aren't okay, and there is someone that's checking in on them and needs to know where they are and when they're going to be back and so on. That's been shown to be protective for young people. Either extreme of parenting, either that very rigid, strict, authoritarian parenting, or the kind of very lenient, hands-off, or can be all sorts of reasons for either of those. And everybody wants the very best for their child, but either end of those parenting kind of extremes have been shown to increase risk when it comes to adolescent substance use. So there is lots that you can do just to build in at home. Those conversations, that kind of general preventative, preemptive, ongoing conversation, start early if you can. If you've got, you saw how many 11-year-olds had already been offered illegal drugs. It's never too late to start, though. If you've missed that moment, you've never had that conversation, it's not too late. Don't feel you've got to be an expert before you can start, but do keep your knowledge as up to date as you can. Do use us as a resource. We've got loads of resources on our website for parents, and I'll signpost to some of those more specifically at the end. Take and make opportunities, any opportunity you can. Whenever anything comes up in the news or on a film or a drama or something you're watching together, that's an opportunity. You might want to make opportunities. You might think this is a conversation we need to be having. Think about when and where works best. Probably not when either of you are feeling under pressure or they're rushing out. Think about when they might be most receptive, when you'll both be feeling relaxed, and remember that little and often is much better than a great big long lecture. 61-minute conversations are much better than one 60-minute conversation on both sides. And do listen. Listening is so important, and listening without judgment is so important for young people. Emphasizing social norms. Not everybody's doing it. A lot of, especially younger teens, tend to overestimate how many older teens are doing stuff. Repetition and reinforcement really does help. Things don't stick in the way that we might think that they should do. And be prepared for tricky questions. Think through what they might be for you. And we get asked at pretty much every parents' workshop when we've got confidential questions, probably not in the open chat, but again, don't forget the media@dsmfoundation.org.uk if you do want to ask a confidential question this evening. But we do get asked at pretty much every parents webinar, what do I say if I did use drugs myself when I was younger? And they ask me straight. We can talk about that later if anyone would like to. And if it all goes horribly wrong, don't give up. It's too important. Hopefully you've had a chance to read through some of those top tips from my teens. Or basically just try to keep that conversation open. Try not to do anything to shut it down by panicking or jumping to the worst conclusions or catastrophizing and doing all the things that is so easy to do as a parent. Some really practical things that you can put in place at home just with their phone. They will have their phone with them even if you're not with them. One thing you can do is get them to set up their in case of emergency details. It just means that if their screen's locked and something goes wrong for any reason, whoever is with them can get hold of you if you are their emergency contact really, really quickly. You can do it on any phone. It's really easy. If you don't know how to do it, ask a teenager and they'll work it out in 2 seconds. Emergency services absolutely love that because they can get hold of the person they need to get hold of. But it could be their friend not knowing how to get hold of their mum when actually they really need to come and get them. The other thing is set them up with an escape plan. Just in case they find themselves somewhere where they don't really want to be there anymore, they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel safe, maybe they're just bored. But sometimes it can be so difficult to get out of those situations without losing face with your friends, which is really important not to do when you're a teenager. So this is just setting them up with an excuse ahead of time. So all you have to do is decide a code. So it could be in a letter, it could be an emoji. Came from a thing called the X Plan. So the original thing was a guy in America, Bert Fulks. So you can look him up. He writes a lot more about it. But it doesn't matter what it is. As long as you both know that's what that will always mean and nothing else. And it's really quick and easy to do. You can then call them and you can feed them an excuse. That's my dad, he's locked himself out, I'm really sorry, I've got to get home now. Whatever it is, it has to be something so that they can go, I'm really sorry, I've just got to go. What you have to promise to do is not to ask any questions, because they may think twice. They may be more than happy to tell you every gory detail, but they may not. And what you don't want is them thinking twice. If they don't feel safe, they really need to get themselves safe. It's also a good idea if they set it up with more than one person, just in case you're not on your phone when they happen to message you and need you urgently there and then. If they're out, you might be, but you know, you have a life too. So it's worth having a backup option as well. The other thing, that a couple of apps that are really useful. First, St John Ambulance First Aid app is really useful. And a useful thing on that is the recovery position. Really, really important life skill to know how to put someone in the recovery position. They could literally save somebody's life. But lots of other useful first aid advice there as well. The other thing that's so useful is what 3 words. If you're not aware of that, I would put it on your phone as well. It's really, really accurate location information. It's all the world has been divided into 3-meter squares and allocated 3 random words. Emergency services, again, love it because they can find people really accurately. In a massive festival field, how are they going to find someone? They've got a postcode, they've got the address, but they can find someone really, really accurately with that. And the other thing with their phone is please, please do encourage them, urge them always to call 999 if something goes wrong for anybody that they're with. They will almost certainly worry about getting in trouble if drugs are involved, but they could literally save somebody's life just by taking that risk. You can explain what will happen if they do that. Someone will talk very calmly, they'll tell them what to do, they'll ask them lots of questions that will help them to cope with that situation. If it needs an ambulance, they'll send one, but then they won't be interested in getting anyone in trouble. They just want to get somebody help. Harm reduction advice. If they are with a friend that's using drugs, they may be that friend, but you can talk about these things often more comfortably if you kind of distance it. So you're not projecting onto them. In the context of this conversation and your child, that might be entirely appropriate, but sometimes it's better to talk in terms of their friends. This is how we address it in school. So we know that they've got this harm reduction information, which is so important if they do find themselves saying yes to something, but we're not making any assumptions about their behaviour. It's really important that they know stuff, including harm reduction advice about whatever the individual substance is, because it's different. There's some general stuff, which is what this sort of thing is, but there's also very specific, because the specific ways that drugs act on the brain and body. Really important to stick together and check in. It's really important that somebody has got a really clear head, preferably more than one person, otherwise it's very boring for that one person. But they need to check in with them regularly. Don't mix stuff. Just changes the effects, changes the risk. It makes it all much more complicated. And there are some things alcohol is one of the worst mixers with a lot of things. And it's the easiest thing in the world if you've had a few too many units to do some stuff that you wouldn't otherwise do. If there's somewhere they can get it tested, absolutely should take up that opportunity, because that really is that last line of defence. If they haven't, but even if they have, all the harm reduction advice is start low, go slow. If it hasn't been tested, you don't know what's in it, you don't know how much is in it. Take it easy, and more isn't better. They've had something and they are feeling amazing. More isn't going to make that a better experience. You can transfer your knowledge from alcohol. You've got to the right place that you want to be in. If you start drinking more, it's probably not going to get better. Food and water is different for different substances. That's where that specific harm reduction advice is really useful. And multiple risk factors that Asha's referenced already, including mental state and expectations and mood and tolerance, and all sorts of things can affect that. And don't forget those legal consequences. But it's really important always to emphasize that any strategies you put in place, you cannot make that risk zero, because risk is really complicated. So how can you tell if your child is using drugs? Well, they might tell you. Someone else might tell you. You might see the effects or after effects, and I'll go through what some of those are. You might find drugs or paraphernalia, any of these things that you can see here, so those little baggies, that blue metallic thing, that's a nitrous oxide charger. So you put the little canister in, put a balloon on the top, give it a twist, but it doesn't look like anything lying around the house. LSD tabs are just absorbent paper, just looks like little stickers, all sorts of things to do with cannabis. Vapes, all sorts of shapes and sizes. Do keep an eye as well on household products, like you can see aerosol there, and you can see lighter fuel, things that could be used and are used by some young people as inhalants. Just keep track of how much that household is going through. And also prescription medication, are the things in cupboards that maybe stuff that you are prescribed you're not using anymore, or things that you are prescribed that you seem to be getting through a lot quicker than you think you should be. Signs to look out for. There can be lots of different signs, and a lot of these signs can mean all sorts of things, but a lot of them would be cause for concern, whatever it is, and a curious, concerned conversation. Social isolation, but also shifts in friendship groups, especially if that friendship group is people who are known or suspected to use drugs. And you might overhear conversations that are drug related. You might see changes in their appearance. Maybe they're not bothering so much with their self-care, but maybe they're building up their muscles suddenly very rapidly, or losing weight. Diet pills are a thing. Maybe their mood is just, they're not themselves. If you see them under the influence of something, of course you'll see their behavior very change, but you might smell stuff, you might either on their breath, their body, their clothing, under the influence of something. You might see the effect on their eyes, pupil dilation, red eyes. That can be a sign of cannabis use. And there may be behavioral changes if their drug use is starting to become something more significant, that's starting to affect their performance at school, and that would be a cause for a concerned conversation from the school as well as with the school. And I would say, I mean, I'm sure Natasha would, Miss Milton, would reinforce this, but if you have got concerns, please do talk to the school. The more you can work together to support children that are struggling about anything, the better for them and for you. So that different conversation, check the basis of your suspicions if you have got your suspicions, but you are the expert on your child. It's easy to lose confidence in that when your children are going through their teens, but you really are. If your radar has been triggered for any reason, then there's probably something going on. Doesn't mean it's anything to do with alcohol or drugs, or actually any major concern in the grand scheme of things. It could be huge for them, but all of those things would be anything that triggers your parental concern is something to follow up. Act as a team. If you're co-parenting with anybody, whether you're doing that in the same place or in different places, it's really important that you're on the same page. Have your disagreements away from your child. If you need to kind of work out different ways or work through different ways that this might be approached, try the very best you can to have a united front with your child. That will really, really help them. And ask your child. You might get to a point where you've just got to front it out. If you know they're continuing to use substances, do talk harm reduction, get that specific information, and do listen. Look over to there on the right, the tips from the teens. Listening is so important. Listening with understanding and not judging, and really trying to work out from them what's going on for them. There's some resources there that are online. That smokefree.gov is really good for. It's the only site we've come across that's got really, really good information for teenagers and vaping who want to cut back and stop. Some very practical strategies, and talk to other people. And you might need to get professional help. Sometimes we're not the we run out of our expertise. We've got lots of expertise as parents, but sometimes we really need to get professional help for our children. There's lots of support for families available online. Drug Fam there also has a helpline for parents you can call and get advice from someone that's been trained to give that advice. AdFam has got lots and lots of information for families on their website, for families who've got concerns about someone else's drug use. And you can find local young people services, because I think you probably come from different places to Forest School, but Frank and the NHS UK sites have got a search function. Catch 22 is a provider in some places, but I don't know that it is necessarily with you. Sorry, that's a legacy from another presentation. And just really important to make sure your children know that you are always there for them. You might not like what they're doing. You might not react very well in that first moment. They might expect nothing else other than a bad reaction, but you would always want to know, you'd always want them to know that you are on their side and you are there for them. And whatever they tell, whatever they bring to you, that's not going to stop you loving them to the end of the universe and right back again. It's easy for them to forget that. They fear our disappointment and judgment and worry more than anything else. Here are some really useful sites to go to, and all of these are on our website as well, and on a link that I'll give you in a minute. But Frank and Crew, loads of information about drugs. Drink Aware Alcohol Education Trust, loads of information about alcohol, and they've both got parents areas as well. The Mix, lots and lots of different things for young people. Young Minds and Hope Learning. Young Minds, masses of stuff about mental health and young people, and there's a parents helpline on there as well if you want to message someone if you're worried about anything. And Hopeline UK is a suicide helpline for teenagers. It's run by, or young people, it's run by Papyrus Trust. It's kind of like Samaritans for young people, so that's really worth flagging up as well. Just before I finish and hand over to Asha, we've got a couple of QR codes here. One is about support for you, and one is about support for us. So the first one, you can access. I don't know if Asha's going to put them in the chat as well. There are links to. There's a link to the webpage that I mentioned at the beginning, where you can download an information leaflet. It's got all of the stuff that we covered in the workshop this evening. There's also, I've written a couple of books for parents as well. One specifically about young people, drugs and decisions. The others much kind of broader about conversations with teenagers. What can make them work? What can make them go a bit wrong? What can help them keep track? But also that the second half is 7 very specific areas of risk and concern. Those really difficult conversations: eating disorders, self-harm, mental ill health, pornography. So have a look at that. The second QR code and link is an opportunity for you to donate to us. If you wanted to become a regular donor, which would be amazing, we'd love to give you a copy of one of my books. But we are also, at the moment, we are part of the Big Give Challenge. And I don't know if you're not aware of that. We have just a week, which finishes on Tuesday now. Any donations that are made at the moment through the Big Give, and you can find that on all of our socials and on the website, anything you give will be doubled. We've got pledges that are then match funded. So we need to try and raise 8,500, and we're on to 5 and a bit thousand. Actually, we're doing really, really well. And then that's going to be doubled. So Asha's put the links to those in the chat. We can only keep on doing what we do. We work with nearly 700 schools now. I've just come down from Scotland yesterday. We are the need and the demand for what we're doing is just growing and growing and growing all the time. But obviously we can only do what we do if we've got the money to do it. But if you'd like to help us, that would be amazing. Right, I think I'm finishing there, and then Asha is going to come on, and I think I might have done the last bit that Asha was going to do, actually, the rounding off bit. Sorry, Asha.
That's all right, that's okay. And I'm not able to put the links into the comments because I'm not on the school's YouTube channel, but I have put them into the private chat, and I'm hoping that someone from the school can put them into the comments so you can see them. But otherwise they are here. The QR codes, you can just have them open like in a different tab or a different window, and then you can always come back to it later if you'd like to. But that might be a way of doing it. We haven't had any questions that we're able to respond to. I've had there's something that's come through, but it's something that I think the school might need to deal with in confidence. And apart from that, I don't think we've had any more, not through our email, and I haven't seen anything in the comments. Has anything come through? I don't know if they pop up under the kind of YouTube stream though. So I don't know if Miss Milton's able to come back and say something about that. I don't know.
Oh no, yeah, sorry, I've got the wrong thing open. Miss Milton's put the links in the chat. Thank you for that. That's just the donate link. Natasha, would you be able to put the parents page link there as well? But it's all on our website anyway. Everything's there, and you can also contact us if you want to get in touch afterwards. You can contact us through the website as well.
Absolutely. I think someone had beforehand put something into the survey about vaping, so I hope that I've answered your questions, because I think it was quite general what you asked. Are we going to be covering it? Which I hope that you feel that we did. I do know that the school is actually doing a session just on vaping next term, which may not have been publicised yet, so do look out for that one, because that I think is dedicated to that, so you'll be able to find out a lot more at that event.
Okay, thank you. So that's it from us. So thank you so much to the school for inviting us along, and thank you so much to you for coming along and listening to us for the last hour. I hope that you found it useful, but you do know where we are if you've got anything more that you want to find out about. So that's it from us. So I don't know if Miss Milton, do you come back, or do we just say goodbye and go? Sorry, this is where we stop looking so smooth and professional.
Yeah, we're I have to say that we do a lot of parent sessions, but we host them ourselves. So this time it feels a bit of a luxury to be hosted by the school through StreamYard, but we kind of don't know what we're doing, so we don't know what else to do.
Oh, here she is.
You have navigated, both of you. You don't need me. So no, you thank you so much. I don't usually come on at the end because it's not about.
Sorry.
No, don't worry. It's about the speakers and the organisation, and you're the expert. So thank you so much publicly. And we will, obviously, if there's any feedback coming through or additional questions coming through, the QR code that I will display shortly, then I'll pass that on to you, Asha and Fiona. But we're really excited at Forest to continue to work with you as a foundation organisation. You've been amazing support and insight to us in terms of our RSHE curriculum, and I hope this is just the beginning. So I'm sure the Forest community will see your faces again. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.